was based upon a study of Tiger Bay that he did before, Tiger Bay in Cardiff, which he did before the Second World War, and his students, Michael Banton and Sheila Patterson, carried on doing similar types of work. In a way, this was a continuation of that mass observation moment of anthropologists trying to study Britain itself, now to try and study the racial dynamics of Britain itself. And the founding assumption of it was that people of colour had to integrate, had to assimilate into British culture. So the best way of doing that was to study their own attitudes and predilections so that policymakers could come up with better mechanisms for integrating them into British culture itself. When the Labour Party gets back into power in 1964, it pushes this type of agenda. It pushes through two Race Relations Act in 1965 and 1968, which basically attempt to outlaw discrimination, to try and outlaw racial discrimination. But the 1965 Act doesn't make it a criminal offence. It's not until 1968 that racial discrimination becomes criminalised in housing, employment, or in public service. And there's now a new Race Relations Board established in 1966, which is to monitor the use of this legislation. Roy Hattersley was a minister in the Home Office for the Labour Party, for the Labour government, and he came out with this phrase, which was really the touchstone for Labour's policy, that without integration, limitation is impossible. Without limitation, integration is impossible. So the Labour Party were trying to straddle the bounds. They were trying to say, look, we don't want a completely restrictive set of immigration acts. We need to foster integration, but both are basically mutually dependent upon each other. The Labour Party desperately trying to have it both ways. And as we'll see, in 1968, the lid sort of comes off when Enoch Powell delivers a very famous speech which shatters the cross-party consensus on questions of immigration. But I'll talk more about that in not next week, but the week after. I don't have time to ask you whether you have questions, and I'm sure you don't in any case, because I can see you all thinking, when's he going to end? Last part of the jigsaw puzzle today is the account of European integration. Now, bizarrely enough, it had been good old Winston Churchill, my old friend, who had the political vision of a United States of Europe, who wanted to, who conceived of Europe as a political alliance that would counteract the new bipolar world of the US and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But Britain very much keeps its distance from the projects of European integration as they developed in the 1940s and the 1950s. Of course, the Marshall Plan was a big part of this process. In many ways, again, the political work of the Marshall Plan was not just to reconstruct Europe, but to provide forms of integration that would make another costly European continental war a thing of the past. And so that a variety of small steps taken before the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957 that sets up the European Economic Community. Most significant probably the coal and steel community set up in 1951 for just those industrial sectors. But by 1957 that's generalized, and it's generalized amongst the original 6 members of the coal and steel community: Belgium, that critical player; France, Italy, that other critical player of Luxembourg; the Netherlands and West Germany. Britain, though, is not interested in being part of the Treaty of Rome. 1957, it's got other fish to fry, not least of which was holding on to what was left of the empire. But that begins to change in the early 1960s, and the question is, why does that happen? It's in 1963 that the Conservative government of Macmillan first tries to join the European Economic Community, and then the Labour Party tries again in 1967, and then finally they apply successfully for membership in 1972 under Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister. So this is a cross-party project. Okay, now the politics of Britain is very much split, with the Conservative Party being the anti-European party, wanting to withdraw from the European project, and the Liberal and the Labour Party being slightly more committed to it. But at this time it's a cross-party thing, and the change of heart comes very simply as a consequence of that accelerated process of decolonisation. The world looked very different to Britain in 1962 than it had in 1957. It had lost most of its Asian and African empire by then. The Americans were pressing Macmillan to get involved so that they could have a seat at the table, if you like, of the European community. But the blunt reality was that Britain needed a new type of economic set of alliances. It had, as we saw last week, the lowest rate of GDP in Europe from 1952 to 1965, so Europe was doing something better than Britain, and trade had begun to rise with the European Union during that time. It rose from 12 to 18%, whereas trade with the Commonwealth had fallen from 45 to 35%. So basically the economics were absolutely as essential as the politics of this process. And I'll have more to say about where Britain is now with the European project in a couple of weeks. Any questions before we wrap this up? Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. The question is, were the white racist groups just targeting people of colour, or were they targeting other types of migrants like the Poles and the Italian and the Irish? And the answer is it's primarily people of colour. The Irish are sometimes included in that. So famously, you'd have signs up on pubs or on houses when rooms were being rented out. No dogs, no Irish, no blacks. But primarily it's aimed at people of colour. And even people of colour, as we'll see next week, I think, are disaggregated. It's much, much worse to be Afro-Caribbean than it is to be a Kashmiri or Indian or Pakistani or, to come from South Asia. It's the Afro-Caribbean population that is seen as the most culturally dangerous. Any other questions? Yeah, again, follow up.
So for the idea of assimilation,
Mm-hmm.
was there a response from the immigrants? How, do they agree with assimilation to that, or do they want to
I think that it's fair to say that nobody quite understood what assimilation was. So that those political organisations like the Indian Workers Association and the Pakistani Welfare Association and West Indian Gazette that I was talking about were less championing a specific cultural heritage. I think that was probably less the case with the West Indian Gazette, because Claudia Jones, the woman who sets up the West India Gazette, also launches the Notting Hill Festival, which is Notting Hill Carnival, in the wake of the riots of 1958, which was a great celebration of West Indian culture. So there was so I guess in the West Indian case there was a clear association of culture with politics. But I think in the other cases, in terms of those organizations, it was very much about trying to achieve the same conditions of work. And they were primarily left organizations that thought of themselves as members of the working class and requiring the same conditions that the trade union and organized labor movement were securing for their workers. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. There were, and I'm going to come to that in a couple of weeks, because actually I think the main influence of the civil rights movement in the US was less on black nationalist politics, which does develop in the late 60s and early 70s in the UK, than with Northern Ireland and the issue of civil rights in Northern Ireland. And in the student movement, actually, would be the other obvious point of connection on this week of planned protests. So clearly what I've been talking about today is a very, very different world to the one that we started the class with in the 1840s and 1850s, where Britain ruled the waves, commanded the globe. Okay? What we've seen today is basically a fundamental restructuring, retreat if you prefer, of Britain's global position. I've talked less of a retreat and more of a restructuring because I think in important ways Britain's global influence continues to be marked, both economically and politically and culturally. But it clearly is less, it's clearly not in the hegemonic imperial role that it had been even in the early mid-1950s. And the real issue then becomes, well, what replaces the British Empire? And, you know, there's the obvious answer to that, which is lots of empires replace the British Empire. America is probably the country that steps into most of the British Empire. But it's also true that you could think of the Russian Empire. You could even think of the European project as its own type of as having its own type of imperial reach particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. It became much less about shoring up Europe to avoid warfare and much more about how much of the former Soviet Union it could reclaim. The other key story I've been trying to tell you today is that the transformation of Britain itself as a sort of multiracial society was a desperately agonized one. And I've just told you the very beginnings of this story. Much of how this plays out in the 1970s and 1980s we'll cover in future lectures. The point that I want you to get here is that there's a real uncertainty about how to deal with these people after the loss of empire. What are the rights that Britain should afford its